Hi, this is Fang, and I will be summarizing the chapter titled Coercion and the Conscience. Sidman opens the chapter by stating that we always have an internal conflict between right and wrong, between the good conscience and the bad conscience. One may want to do something that they know isn't good, but they are uncertain about the outcome of the action. Sidman provides example of accepting bribes or giving false information in hopes of receiving grants and prizes. But at the end of the day, we may be susceptible to facing punishment, such as being in prison or getting fines. Sidman mentions that we won't feel the temptations once we have a well-developed conscience. He asserts that conscience is not a thing to be felt and it does not control our actions, but that it is a tendency to behave in a manner that is appropriate and right when other contingencies, namely punishment, pulls us to the other direction. Sidman continues to elaborate that although many people consider conscience as the ability to differentiate right from wrong and be willing to take the right course of action, children, especially infants and toddlers, do not have a conscience of their own because they are selfish. They see the world through self-centered lens and only think of themselves and not anybody else. Sidman ends this section with a question of how does a mindset of right and wrong develop, and at what point does a child who start out as selfish become a conscientious, law-abiding citizen. In this section of The Origins of the Conscience, Sidman states that conscience is derived from coercive control. We learn that behavior is bad when we are being punished or threatened of punishment. When we are punished, we learn to stop behaving in a way that gets us punished, and this becomes part of our conscience when we avoid certain behaviors or events that provokes punishment. In Freudian terms, conscience is actually the superego, which is the part of the self that restrains selfish, immoral, or unethical behavior. Sidman emphasizes that the superego is important because that is where we get our definition of right and wrong in the social context. We give credit to the small voice from within when we engage in behavior that has moral and ethical value. People often forget where social coercion originates, but it starts out in the conscience. Therefore, conscience is a social phenomenon. And going back to the rat experiment scenario, the rat pushed the lever in order to get food, but now that lever served as a shock or a punishment. So every time the rat pushes the lever, it receives a shock. Although pushing the lever has a long history of reinforcement, the rat still attempts to push the lever, but with hesitancy. We see that the rat pushes the lever less and less, and eventually it stays away from the lever completely. Touching the lever was associated as bad due to the punishing effects that it delivered, and that the right thing to do was to stay away from the lever, so it would not be shocked. Applying this to the real world, an infant who is beginning to learn new things, such as reaching out for a mother's hug, turning the pages of books, pushing buttons, and crawling, receive nothing but positive attention and affection from the mom. However, in situations where the child tips over a vase, the mom delivers a reprimanding "No, don't touch that, bad," and a slap on the hand. Now the child receives their first punishment. Over time, as a child repeats the same behavior, it also gets the same punishment from the mom. The child would then also produce its own warning signal and mimics the mom until it becomes internalized, and the action of tipping over the vase also becomes less frequent. In both scenarios, the rat and the child were punished and warned for the actions they committed. The child was warned by the mother, and the rat's hesitant movements towards the lever served as a warning sign. The rat's conscience was only limited to non-vocalized warning signals from its own behavior, while the child's conscience comprised not only the direct punishment, but also the words that served as a warning for impending punishment. In both the verbal and non-verbal instances, the conscience constitutes behaviors that functions as a warning sign, which then becomes avoidance. In this section of conscience and control, Sidman begins by saying that people's action cannot be monitored 24/7 because it isn't possible. However, it is more practical to monitor kids during their childhood years in developing their conscience. We teach what is permissible and what is not by laying down rules and establishing limits. If they do something they weren't supposed to, they get punished. We don't reinforce good behavior, but simply withhold punishment. During adolescence, parents, teachers, and any adult figure keep a close eye on the adolescent due to exploration on sexuality and the like. Sidman indicates that those that have been trained to have a strong conscience are labeled to be reliable, brave, and clean. They will avoid any uncharted territories and shrink back from anything unconventional. They do not adapt well to change in society because of the coercive control through punishment that they have become accustomed to. This is what happens to people who grow up in tightly coercive environments. Those who are tempted to engage in behaviors that is considered bad are in conflict with their conscience and will find themselves not only in a position of distrust from the community, but also in themselves. As a result, Sidman affirms that personality disorders and neuroses are derived from individuals that come from coercive environments. Sidman argues that therapy would not be an effective method to fix the inner conflicts because no therapist can access our internal thoughts and conditions. For effective therapy to take place, one must be aware of the causes of our modified behavior and problem behavior and the outside world contingencies that impacts it. Is the conscience to be trusted? In this subsection of conscience and control, Sidman states that conscience is needed for survival in the world. The question of whether or not the function of the conscience has achieved what it was intended to, or if it benefits the community at large by keeping the individual under control, still stands. Psychiatrists and psychologists have not resolved misdemeanors such as theft, murder, or dishonesty. Sidman makes it clear that the coercive practices that society imposes on individuals did not achieve its intended goal because some people still have psychopathic personalities. People find ways to bend the law and escape punishment. The strong can oppress the punishers, those in power can override those who are trying to expose their dishonesty, etc. It appears that the weak, poor, and outcasts are getting punished, while those in superior positions, those who are wealthy, and the presidents are living a lifestyle that contradicts one's conscience. Sidman claims that coercive control became a double standard. Coercive control works against those who cannot support themselves and sustains those in position. It comes down to the issue that morality has to be dependent on something else other than coercive control. Sidman strongly suggests that we could rely on positive reinforcement for doing the right thing instead of being punished for doing the wrong thing. If morality was based on positive reinforcement, then that may result in benefits that make the difficulties worth it. Sidman ends the chapter stating that a conscience that is based on the avoidance of potential threats or punishment will need a replacement behavior. So Sidman refers to the conscience as having its roots in coercive control. My question to you guys is, how has this chapter shaped or formed your perspective on conscience in terms of coercive control? Thanks.